Hey everybody, it's 5:25. We'll call to order the Executive Operations Committee with 2 additional citizen members under Portage County Code of Ordinances, section 3.1.9, parens 2 and parens 12. Public notice: members of the public who wish to address the committee on specific agenda items must register their request at this time, with such comments subject to the reasonable control of the committee chair as set forth in Robert's Rules of Order.
First up is Tor Anderson. Second is Lisa Anderson.
Thank you for allowing me to make some comments. I think the bottom line for you to remember in all these code of conduct complaints is that the water advocacy in Nelsonville is all about health concerns and concerns with cancer and thyroid disease.
We can't hear you on this end, you're muted.
I'll give you a microphone.
Can you hear me? I can hear you now. I can hear Barry, but I can't, Maria's muted. This is live, but it's muted. There we go. We got it now.
Thank you. I think the bottom line for you all to remember in all these code of conduct complaints is that water advocacy in Nelsonville is about health and concerns with certain cancers and thyroid disease, and we need LWCC to pursue solutions. We want things to change at Land and Water Conservation Committee meetings. These code of conduct complaints regarding Supervisor Peterson's behaviors are making a statement that we want a stop to the silencing of science and truth at lock-on meetings. We want to stop to the spread of false facts, false narratives, and the lies that come from making misleading statements which are out of context. We want to stop to the bias and double standards that are described in the ethics complaints. We want to stop to the hostility we receive for simply asking the county to execute its responsibilities mandated in state code to protect and remediate state waters. And even as we were seeking these improvements at the Ethics Committee meeting last month, we witnessed a continuation of typical behaviors seen at lock-on meetings, as we were again addressed as spoiled children. Right here, right in front of the actual Ethics Committee who is considering these violations. Lock-on leadership again shamelessly hurled yet another insult at us. Can you imagine how much worse it is at the lock-on meetings when the Ethics Committee isn't watching? Yeah, it's bad. And that's why this committee's resolution for action is so important. The last Ethics Committee meeting was a perfect example of the treatment we face, month in and month out, and which we have detailed in our complaints and in the video evidence presented to every county supervisor to see. And that is why I want this committee to amend the resolution to a more significant response to the Code of Conduct violations. Thank you.
Anderson, and then John Bertelson.
Yeah, there's no handouts.
Oh, excuse me, but there was last month you allowed Supervisor Peterson.
Peterson did it.
Yep, you allowed Peterson to.
That's the truth.
Don, do you want to address or you want me to?
This is the same kind of problems that we always face.
Can you hear?
You accepted it last month. Can I go on?
Make your public comment. There's no handouts during public comment.
But there was last time, this is very.
Supervisor Peterson is responding to code of conduct violation, so out of fundamental fairness pursuant to our code, he's provided an opportunity to provide a handout, to provide a written response. That's the distinction.
I don't believe outside of the hearing.
Wow,
I just don't like that.
that's very, this is very troubling. This is exactly the kind of unfair treatment that we get. And normally it's on the Land and Water Conservation Committee, but my statement. Supervisor Peterson said the quiet part out loud. Farmers take precedence over science. That's what this is about. It seems we're always chasing the last injustice while these supervisors have moved on to the next effort to avoid the county's state mandated oversight of water pollution. I'll get to that. Concerning the complaint I brought, the committee was confused about whether a complaint was based on valid public comment timing, and Chair Haga spoke at length about how the public doesn't understand how things work. We do understand. Prior to the recent ordinance change, we had no opportunity for public comment if the chair decided not to let us speak. We drive a half hour to get here and we were shut down. Then even when there was public comment allowed at the beginning of the meeting, when that came along, they would make egregious false claims and narratives when discussing an agenda item, and then we'd have to wait for the next meeting to address it. Hence, the desire to submit something in writing that would have to be considered. Many parts of our complaints were dismissed due to a claim that the committee chair gets to decide about correspondence. What is fair? What constitutes listening to researching constituents? The point is the bias that puts the county in the position of defying state law. I appreciate the time and effort you all have put in on these complaints. I see that Supervisor Peterson is requesting payment for the Exec Ops violations meeting for which he was found to have violated the code of conduct. I wish you knew the many hours I invested in making the complaint and bringing you evidence of the veracity of my complaints. It was beyond disappointing that you weren't allowed to consider all the evidence. In fact, I take issue with the fact that Corp Counsel sat on the complaints for a couple of months, which surely violated the intent of the Code of Conduct Directive to act within 10 days, and that we spent over $400 and had to wait 5 months for open records requests that I used to verify my assertions, and they weren't even allowed to be considered in this process. I'm not here to make money or to bolster my profession, but I ask you to consider who has something financial to gain from this dispute over drinking water protection. The supervisors at the last meeting claimed the complainants were on a political witch hunt, and Supervisor Zukowski said they are the typical spoiled children. Interesting, because Supervisor Matt Zukowski accused hydrologist Pete Arnson of, quote, acting like a spoiled child that did not get their way. That's what's on the handout. Pete Arnson laid out how the problem could be improved in the document I shared with you. I wish that you would read it. He was cordial and persistent and was treated as if he was a child. Our motives are simple. We want to have safe drinking water and our water is polluted. We're faced with a hostile, fact-defying force on the Land and Water Conservation Committee. Jen McNally faced this hostile work environment where her competence and integrity were constantly being questioned and actions were taken regularly to undermine her work. And now she's quit. Now I fear that these supervisors are on to their next effort to hinder the county's ability to protect and reverse contamination of our water by moving any part or all of Jen's job to the oversight and control of the Ag and Extension Committee. It's all about weakening the effort and controlling the narrative. If you don't stop them from violating the code of conduct and take steps to lift Portage County out of some of the lowest rankings in the state for nitrate contaminated water. Who will?
John Bertelson and then Ray Reeser. And that's overriding the system, so we're not gonna use them, like, I don't know, sorry.
I'll speak.
IT specialist.
I'll speak loud, hopefully people can hear me. John Bertelson, 3300 Arborvitae Lane, Clover. I speak for myself, not any organization I'm part of. Here we are today, the end of a 2-year train wreck. A decision has now been made by county leadership, and hopefully many lessons have been learned, so this will not happen again. I have been attending the monthly Land and Water Conservation Committee meetings since I became interested in the workings of county government. That was when I met Mr. John Pavelski, who was running for county executive. I began attending these meetings April of 2022, which just happened to be election day. Room was empty. That was 2 years ago. In May, the new board begins. Early May, Land and Water Conservation meeting. So I was there for Supervisor Peterson's first meeting as chair. That was Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022. It was a full room, and Chair Peterson opened up the room to unlimited public comment. Wow. The May 5th, 2022 Stevens Point Journal headline of the meeting read, "The DNR is poised to impose well monitoring on Gordondale farms to regulate years of nitrate issues. How it's paid for is a sticking point." This is why there was a room full of people for Chair Peterson's first meeting. I will now read a few lines from the article which I think are important here. The reporter writes, "Residents had accused the farm of polluting their wells with unsafe levels of nitrates and causing disease, cancer, miscarriages, and killing their pets. Mr. John Pavelski, county executive, said he fears if a solution is not found, a lawsuit could come forward. Quote, if litigation comes forward, then that's going to probably drown this thing for next year to a year and a half, and we're not going to get the results that citizens want, Pavelski said. Quote, we have to stop fighting each other and start fighting the problem. That's the nitrates. Again, 2 years ago, Executive Pavelski assessed this Land and Water Conservation Committee correctly. 2 years later, today, we have to stop fighting each other and start fighting the problem. That's the nitrates. Okay, Supervisor Peterson will now watch 5 video webinars and Portage County leadership will be satisfied. Not me. This next request is a suggestion. I suggest this Exec Ops Committee strongly encourage Supervisor Peterson to use his experience and the learnings from these 5 webinars to create a training video for any new candidate running for a county supervisor position. We can learn from this. We should learn from this. Thank you for your time.
Ray Reeser and then Pat Quigley.
Ray Visser, Town of New Hope, former county board member, current Town of New Hope board member. Proud owner of a contaminated rural well. I've got a few comments and then a few suggestions. The process the committee worked through The process the committee worked through to come to this point was new and not as straightforward as it could have been. I thank you all for that work. Cases like this are never easy. I think the ordinance itself is quite clear, but with due respect to our own and outside counsel, I am still baffled by the instructions council gave to this committee based on their interpretation of our ordinance. I can categorically state, never in any town, county, UW, or state committee I have sat on have I ever been instructed to ignore all of the evidence, including, in this case, evidence recorded and held by this county when making an informed decision. That approach is definitely not codified in our ordinance, and I do not believe it should be. I also do not believe it worked well here. I don't typically believe it's good practice to go after colleagues or supervisors, especially in an open public meeting. I'm going to make an exception here because many of us are tired of having our intelligence and our credibility insulted. At the last meeting, Mr. Jakowski characterized the citizens of Nelsonville and those residents who submitted sworn, verified code of conduct complaints as spoiled children. That in itself, as others have mentioned, is a clear violation of our code of conduct and reflects the same exact issues that are on the table. I asked this committee, I asked our council, heck, I asked the entire room, when did it become okay, or when is it the case that citizens who are dealing with polluted water and come to a committee which is statutorily charged under state law with dealing with that problem, when is it okay for us to be called spoiled children? I don't find that acceptable, gentlemen. I also find it a bit ironic that Mr. Jakowski has requested not to use his county email. I live in a very rural district. I have intermittent net coverage. I never requested not to use my email. I find it curious that Mr. Jakowski has a farm email listed online. That suggests that someone monitors that email. It also makes it extremely difficult to do an open records request on that county supervisor. The same county supervisor who worked on an open records request against me when I was a brand new supervisor. I see that as a double standard. Now, a couple of suggestions. The complaint process needs to be improved, including letting citizens know that this committee will not consider any electronic evidence nor any other evidence initially when they review a complaint. That is not the codified standard that we have. I suggest a working group to include citizens on improving the process be pulled together, but not to reduce its effectiveness, to improve it. I also strongly suggest to this entire committee and to the county board that any repercussions for violations of any ordinance, and specifically the code of conduct ordinance in this county, reflect the severity of the violation. I'm telling you, gentlemen, watching a couple videos on how to run a meeting, that just doesn't cut it. And I think I speak for just about everybody in this room. Thank you for listening.
Pat Quigley and then Mildred Neville.
Hello, my name is Pat Quigley. I live in the town of New Hope. I've attended many WLWCC committee meetings over the past few years, and I've witnessed firsthand how this committee operates. There's an obvious bias in favor of agriculture interests. Supervisor Peterson said it himself. Farmers take precedence over it. The "it" was science. The statement isn't a false accusation, and it isn't taken out of context. Supervisor Peterson made the mistake of saying the quiet part out loud, and that's why we're all here today. The vast majority of these complaints have to do with denying a person the opportunity to speak or denying the opportunity to present information that might conflict with Mr. Peterson's own beliefs or personal agenda. He may have had the right to do that, or he may not have. Either way, it's still biased and it's still unethical. When you serve the public, you're obligated to listen to and consider both sides of an argument, even if you disagree with them. Despite being instructed to ignore the evidence and then claim there were insufficient facts, you still found 28 violations of the Code of Ethics. I find your corrective actions to be totally inadequate and inappropriate relative to the violations. Corrective action number 1, Supervisor Peterson should be directed to adhere to the Portage County Code of Conduct. Really? Are we supposed to believe that Mr. Peterson wasn't aware that the Code of Ethics applied to him? Shouldn't this happen when a supervisor is sworn into office? What's the consequence if he doesn't? Corrective action number 2, watch some videos on how to run a meeting. Shouldn't this be required before you ever sit on a committee? How do these address the harassment of county staff? How do these address farmers take precedence over science? It doesn't. You discussed the root cause of this mess at the last meeting, but completely ignored it in your corrective actions. Supervisor Peterson was not prepared and should never have been allowed to chair a committee with no previous experience, whether he watches videos or not. The county set him up to fail. It looks to me like you were more interested in covering your own mistakes rather than correcting the real problem. I would make a suggestion that you set some minimum requirements for a committee chair before the next board takes office. The people of Portage County deserve better leadership than this. Thank you.
Mildred Neville, and then George Kraft.
So we're talking about code of conduct. But the real issue is clean water. And I was on the Land and Water Conservation Committee for 2 years. I went on it in April of 2020. And immediately after the meeting started, I was going to Chair Hagan after each meeting and telling them that terrible stuff was taking place at the meetings and something needed to be done. And basically the response I got over time was, he can only talk to the person. This was when Barry Jakowski was the chair. And what we needed was a code of conduct. Well, we finally got a code of conduct. And here we are, 4 years later. Not just the last 2 that Mr. Bertelson's aware of, but 2 more. When I first went to these meetings 4 years ago, I was staggered by how polite, careful, positive the citizens of Nelsonville were in talking with the committee. I haven't really seen that change over time, but it was, you couldn't have had citizens talking to a committee in a nicer way than what I saw. And what I saw when I went to those meetings was the worst committee, unlike any committee I had been on in the previous 2 years. And I tried to do what I could. But it's a 6-member committee. It's 3 of the people, and 3 and 3, and things fail. The efforts to get a 7th member, one of them involved what I believe to be a violation of the open meetings law, which is still to be pursued further. But in any event, it's very discouraging for me to see we're talking about the need for clean water, and we're you're talking about when water is continuing to be polluted, it's not just for today or tomorrow or the next day, it's going forward into the future. And it's not just for this one small area in Portage County. I think it's misleading in the resolution that's presented tonight to say in the first paragraph something about their 5 complaints were brought forward. It should say something like multiple complaints were brought forward from 5 complainants. There were 5 people who brought forward complaints, not 5 complaints brought forward. 28 of them were found to be valid. Clearly, more of those complaints were valid, but because of the way the committee looked at the evidence, they failed to see what was plainly there. So, for Mr. Peterson, there's no timeline for completing these webinars he's asked to do. There's no proof that he completes them. At the very least, there needs to be some kind of timeline put in. There needs to be somebody he reports to when he starts to do a webinar and when he completes the webinar. Otherwise, I mean, I'm not sure that that's going to do much good. But to have it just open-ended, like do this, because when you become a supervisor, you're told the code of conduct applies to you. You know you're supposed to abide by the code of conduct. So I hope going forward, some changes can come about. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is this committee, which is not the Executive Ops Committee. It's the Executive Ops Committee / Code of Conduct or / Ethics or Executive Ops +2. It needs to be treated as a true committee, not as something that can kind of have things brushed under the table, which is how it looks to me. So, thank you.
George Kraft and then Pete Arneson.
Gentlemen of the committee, I think well, first of all, thanks for your service through this long and rather arduous process here. I think we all learned something here. A couple of them that, we've had a dysfunctional conservation committee for years, isn't the last 2 years, but perhaps been especially bad the last 2. We see a committee, Mr. Peterson's behavior showed it more interested in protecting the reputation of agriculture than finding out causes of problems and fixing them. We have to take care of that. I think the other thing we found out is that this code of conduct process needs some tinkering with here. For instance, I never had a clue that in the form I was required to fill out, that you would never look at my witnesses or the evidence I was going to put forward. And if we had dug into some of those things, we would have learned some important pieces, I think, on all the goings on. To get to the point about the corrective actions here, so I don't see the corrective actions addressing Mr. Peterson's biases here. It would be nice if there was something else that was there that would talk about treating without bias. But perhaps most importantly, you'll remember one of the complaints had to deal with harassment of a county water quality specialist, Jen McNally, who's leaving us in more than small part because of what she has to put up with in her job and the harassment that comes from county supervisors. You read the complaint about what Mr. Peterson has done multiple times. And if you had the time, and I understand you didn't, to look at the evidence, you would have heard from HR that there are complaints sitting in their files about how county supervisors have treated Jen. All right, this shouldn't be allowed to stand. You remember, because I was on the site, When Mr. Peterson showed up there, we were drilling holes, I was a volunteer there, and then he goes after Jen McNelly like a bandy rooster chasing a hen. And he berated her, and he said to her, I'm here to make sure you're not just sunbathing. Who says that to a woman in the 21st century? If this was your wife or your daughter, or perhaps granddaughters for some of us here, what would you have done if you'd been there? By the time you left, I see Jen is reduced to near tears. And I don't see anything in the corrective actions here to talk about how you don't harass and you don't show bias against other people, especially employees who are under your thumb, okay? So my suggestion here is that you amend the resolution and you find something, because HR has courses on this. Every workplace that I know of has, larger workplaces, has courses that employees have to take about computer security, sexual harassment, employee bias and all these kind of things. And I think you need to get that into your resolution here. It's a short amendment directing Mr. Peterson to see HR and take a course about proper treatment of people without hostility, especially when they're under your power. Thank you.
Keith Arnson and then Glenn Conan.
Hi, Pete Arnson, Stevens Point. I guess I would like to echo a number of those things that have been brought up and kind of emphasize putting the responsibility really on the county leadership. You've been talking about Dave and the actions that led to this and gone through this process, but there was issues with leadership. Executive ops is a prime start, the chairman. As has been mentioned, we've known there has been dysfunction in the Law-Con Committee for a long time, and it's been brought up to executive ops and the chairman. And the chairman actually participated for a while. He listened and would sit in on some meetings, and those meetings generally went better. Sometimes he'd attend remotely, and things deteriorated a little bit. When he wasn't there was when things got wacky. So there's a supervisory type thing that, you shouldn't need a babysitter to run these meetings. And then getting to how the training of supervisors, especially new supervisors. I don't know what the training procedures entail when you're a new supervisor. But certainly it should cover rules of conduct, it should cover ethics, and if that message isn't getting across, which apparently it wasn't, that needs to be emphasized. And so these are all learning things that the chairman and committee can learn from. What can we do about it? What do we have to do to try to limit this from happening again? And you can't really go by the mentorship kind of approach, which I wondered if that wasn't being done. Dave, vice chair, was Barry Chakowski. Barry's been doing this thing, running meetings for years and years and years, and you think he would have provided some guidance on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And clearly that didn't happen in terms of better control of meetings. And so it goes back to training, but also responsibility and who is, qualified. Make sure your people, your supervisors, are trained and understand what's going on. So, again, this has been a process, and I think we've all learned a lot, and I presume Executive Ops has, and I'll be interested to see what kind of changes are made going forward. Thanks.
Glenn Conan.
My name is Glenn Conan, and I live in District 25, which is represented by David Peterson. I'd like to say everything that everyone here has already said. these meetings have been run by Mr. Peterson in a very inappropriate way, and really, you know, I don't think any kind of training is gonna improve that. I thought myself that he would actually step down from that position, not only as the head of the committee, but maybe even of the county board. He is an embarrassment to me as a constituent. I don't believe he represents the constituents that voted him in completely. The committee he heads, the Land and Water Committee, we're here because we're not a bunch of children. We're here because many of us have nitrates in our water. We have a neighbor building a house, just put in a 125-foot well. His nitrates are at 30. It's a problem. And when you go to these meetings that Dave Peterson runs, you're belittled by the fact that you're concerned about the water. He said, put a filtering system in there. That's his idea of solving the problem. So I think the idea of you punishing him for the 28 counts for going to a class or a number of classes to improve himself is bogus. I'd like to see him step down from the position. Thank you for hearing me.
First item this evening is discussion possible action regarding approving and adopting the recommendations of Executive Operations Committee regarding the code of conduct complaint filed against Supervisor Dave Peterson. Make a motion to get it on the floor for discussion. Also move to get it on the floor. Second. Motion by Jankowski, second by Pataki. Discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to say something as a citizen. It's been interesting. Anyway, I was in the appraisal business, and a number of years ago, I was in Mr. Peterson's position. I did an appraisal for some people. They didn't like the number I came up with, and they thought the number should be much higher because they were going to sell their house, and I didn't give them enough credit for the finish in the basement. Beside the point. So anyway, he turned me in, and I had to go down to Milwaukee to the appraisal board, and they said at the time, well, we're going to have to fine you. And I thought, how much? And they said X. And it was a fairly substantial number, and I thought, $1,000 is a lot of money for not making the right adjustment. Well, anyway, they said, well, they would think about it, and a couple weeks later, I got a letter, and it said, we've decided that we're not going to fine you. And I thought, you know, that's the answer I'm looking for. However, the next paragraph said, you will have to attend the following courses. Well, one of them was within 60 days, and Mildred Neville said a certain time I had to do it. So one, I had to go to Indiana for some classes, I had to go to Madison for a class on the Code of Ethics, how to make the adjustments. The adjustments were fine, but I didn't explain them in my appraisal. Well, the long and the short is, I would have went way ahead to pay the money than to go to the courses. But by taking the courses, which I got a lot out of, but it was time consuming, I thought it was well worth it. And it made me, one, a much better appraisal, and two, I turned out a much better product as I went on in the appraisal business. So, but it would have been much cheaper had I just wrote the check and been done. Not spent the nights in the motels and not being able to produce appraisals for a week almost. So when you say just take the courses, I don't know how good or bad they are, but they can be rewarding if you take them and take them to heart. So that's all I want to say.
There's the rub.
Pardon?
There's the rub. You take it to heart. Where's our guarantee?
Any other discussion? discussion from committee members? Seeing none, all those in favor with aye? Aye.
Aye.
You've got to be kidding.
Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Are you seriously, that is
I'll
it?
take a motion to adjourn.
Almost.
Second. Motion by Jankowski, second by Haga. All those in favor with aye? Aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned.
Unbelievable. Not even courtesy of a discussion. Wow. Unbelievable. Not even the courtesy of a discussion.
Yeah, I'll put it back.
Yes.